So as Lorena mentioned, my name is Julia Mais. I'm a project coordinator with OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. And today I'm going to be giving you some information about a report that we recently completed. So the main topics are youth rights in Canada concerning certain populations. So for those of you who are familiar with OCASI, we're a membership-based organization. We have over 200 members in the settlement sector, and we aim to act as a collective voice for the sector and respond to shared needs and concerns. So this summer we were asked to submit a report to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child concerning the rights of certain groups in Canada. And these groups were African Canadian youth, Roma youth, refugee youth, and migrant youth. So I'll be speaking a bit about some of the trends that came up for several or some of these groups during our report, and there's some copies at the back if you want to have a more in-depth look afterwards. So with these four groups, the African Canadian population is a bit distinct, as it's not a group that's, there are some newcomers, but definitely not exclusively newcomers, and most have been here for generations. So for this, we relied on research that was done from the African Canadian Legal Clinic. So I'll focus a bit more on the other groups, as they would have more of immigration concerns to do it with the audience that is here. But I'll just speak briefly about some of the concerns that our partners raised. And this was the disproportionate amount of African Canadian youth in state care. It's much just disproportionate to other populations, and also high rates of being expelled from the school system and high representation in the jail system. So these were some of the key concerns that we raised. And the difference here between groups that may have immigration challenges and the African Canadian population is that most of this is almost exclusively due to discrimination, as people would not necessarily have had those immigration challenges that, say, Roma refugees face right now. And of course, some of the issues that I'll cover, they can affect both youth and adults. So something like family separation, for example, this affects youth and adults, but it is experienced differently. So what family separation means for an adult and a youth is very different. While heartbreaking for both groups, it has different impacts. And I'd also like to preempt by just saying that the report was aimed at decision makers. We were hoping to draw light to some of our concerns about the policies and structures that we have in place in Canada, and hoping to make positive change in this respect through our submission to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. And although we're all small decision makers, I would assume that most people here are in the settlement sector, so our role is a bit different. So I apologize if it's too kind of big picture, but hopefully my colleagues will speak more about the frontline aspects as well. So firstly, one of the key challenges that we identified for migrant, Roma, and refugee youth is education. Several of the youth that we interviewed brought up lack of access to post-secondary education as being a big challenge for them. They said that they felt very frustrated by not being able to pursue post-secondary. And for many newcomers, post-secondary education is prohibitive because if you don't have permanent residency status, you need to pay international fees, which, as we know, are significantly higher than domestic fees. Also, individuals without permanent residency are not eligible for OSAP loans. So this can also be prohibitive to going on. Some other concerns were some reports that identified the streaming of refugee youth into non-academic streams as being a concern, as this affects them later on if they want to go on to university or college. And also high dropout rates, low graduation rates for some youth that are in the ESL stream. Family separation is also a big challenge, and this is something that was through the report for all the groups that experience immigration challenges. So one group in particular that can be affected by family separation is unaccompanied minors. So if a child under 18 is coming to Canada by themselves, they can't include their parents or their siblings on their permanent residency application. This is a shame because it leaves them without the support that they could really benefit from. Also, once they are of age, it can also be difficult to sponsor family, as there is an income requirement, and you do have to meet that income requirement to be able to sponsor relatives. And as we know with Canadian youth or newcomer youth, they're amongst the most marginalized in the labor market. So their chances of earning a significant amount would be reduced. We are also concerned with uneven sponsorship wait times across the world. Different processing offices have different wait times. And of course, being separated from family is a great concern. And then another group we identified as disproportionately experiencing family separation is the children of living caregivers. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the program, the Living Caregiver Program is primarily composed of women from the Philippines who come to Canada on a temporary visa, and they need to work and live in their employer's home for 2 years, or there's a certain minimum amount of hours. And after that, they can apply for a permanent residency and then apply to bring their children over. So what this means in practice is that there's a minimum of several years separation for the children, and this is hard for them both when they're away from their mothers and living in the Philippines, and also once they're reunited and they're then away from their habitual caregiver in the Philippines, and also going through all the regular settlement challenges that youth face in Canada. And although our report focused on youth who are in the country, and this isn't part of the report, but I think the question of living caregivers also brings up the issue of what's happening to all the children of all the other temporary foreign workers who are here, usually without their families. In terms of health, many refugee youth have experienced a trauma before they arrive in Canada, and some may have physical or mental health concerns. And this problem is exacerbated now with the cuts to the interim federal health program, where it's much more challenging to access health care if you don't have status, or if you're in the process of gaining that. And also the OHIP 3-month wait period is something that OCASI has spoken about in the past and we're still concerned about. And I'm sure if there's Swiss workers in the room, you're very familiar with this problem, that if individuals can't afford private insurance for the first 3 months, they're in an extremely vulnerable situation. Lastly, I'll speak to some of the difficulties in obtaining status, particularly with refugee protection. And these challenges, some of them already existed, and some are being exacerbated by the implementation of Bill C-31, which goes into effect this Saturday, December 15th. So at the moment, the system that we have in Canada for achieving refugee status is to go through the Immigrant and Refugee Board hearings. And this process is quite complicated for adults or for youth. You need to assemble all your evidence, prepare a claim, find legal representation, learn how to work with lawyers if you're fortunate enough to have one. So it is quite difficult for an average person to do. But this is being exacerbated now with the even shorter wait times. And of course for youth, if they don't have adult support in filling out all these forms and participating in a hearing, it can take them even more time to prepare their hearing, and it's more challenging for them. Also, the Immigrant and Refugee Board hearings have been shown to have uneven success rates. So Sean Rehag, for example, has done some studies showing different acceptance rates from the different board members. And we see that right now, Roma refugees have got very low acceptance rates when in the past they were much higher. So this is problematic. Also, youth who are from certain countries will have much lower chances of having successful claims with the implementation of the clauses of designated countries of origin and irregular arrival provisions. So the designated countries of origin hasn't come into effect yet. There haven't been any named. But we can assume or predict that Hungary might be one of the ones that would be put on that list due to the rhetoric that we've been hearing from Jason Kenney lately. So this means that there's a very low chance of having a successful claim if you are from these so-called safe countries that are named. And it should be more about what the individual's experience is than where they're from. Also, the irregular arrival provision, basically when groups arrive, they would be treated differently than individuals. And so this also gives youth a lower chance of having a successful refugee claim. Yeah, so I guess right now there is a lot of difficulties in obtaining status, and this will only be worsened come December 14th when these are implemented. And then there's also the concern of youth who are living in Canada right now without status. Of course, it's very difficult to access services if you're in that position. And most settlement services are government funded, and therefore they're not eligible if they don't have status. So this can leave people in a very vulnerable situation. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the intended audience of the report was decision makers. So in a perfect world, we could just snap our fingers and change all these problems, all these issues, and make them disappear. But that doesn't, for most of us, we don't have the power to do that. So some suggestions that I would have is if you're able to engage in advocacy, that is a very common route through which policy change takes place. I know that there are limitations for government-funded agencies and the amount of advocacy they can participate in. But if you are able to, I think that's very important. Or else supporting your colleagues who might be in a different position where they can be more vocal about some of these concerns that we have and some of the ways that policies are affecting youth. As well as supporting colleagues who are able to work with youth without status. Another aspect is collaboration between sectors. So we're not the only ones who work with newcomer youth, with refugee youth, migrant youth. Also, there's social services workers, housing workers. So there are many people who are all working with this population. And for them, they might have a much lower knowledge of the immigration system and of settlement challenges than we do in this sector. So I think information sharing between sectors is very important so that youth can be supported from all different angles. Also, most settlement services are aimed at adults, that there is a growing number of newcomers who are youth, and having youth-specific settlement services is very useful because they do face particular challenges that adults might not. And then lastly, recognizing the context in which youth are coming to Canada. So they're coming right now during this big political debate and during times of uncertainty. So recognizing what their experiences are and also the diversity in experiences. For example, some come with their families or coming alone or at different processes in obtaining status or not having status. So I think recognizing all that diversity is important as we support the youth that we work with. So those are just some of the highlights from the report. And as I mentioned, there's some at the back if you'd like, and I also copied Ocasie's position on Bill C-31 for your information if you're interested. Thank you.